Thank you. So hi, I'm Emily, this is Scarlett, and this is Chris Packham. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. I work at SOS, and I'm helping the Teach the Parent crew today. So yeah, thank you for joining us today for this Teach the Parent live stream. It's a new campaign where you as young people can drive sustainable action, which is really exciting. You know, we're frustrated by the lack of climate action from our political leaders, so we're driving action instead by talking to our parents and carers and guardians and asking them to join us. And it's all about how small chats can have a big influence. And we've been hosting monthly live streams on the themes that you said were important to you, talking to a different expert. And so every month we'll give you some easy to follow actions about what you can do by teaching your parents and by talking to the people that you love. And you can join our campaign on our website, which is teachtheparent.org. So I'm really thrilled that we have Chris Packham speaking with us this afternoon. You may know him from Springwatch. Chris is a well-known naturalist, broadcaster, author, and award-winning wildlife photographer. He's known for his environmental campaigning and wildlife conservation work. He champions issues around biodiversity, which will be our topic today, at every level. So thank you so much for joining, Chris. This short introduction does not do justice to your work, so I'd love for you to introduce yourself, if that's okay.
Well, my name is Chris Packham. I am 63 years old, and I developed a love for life 60 years ago, I imagine, sometime between the ages of 2 and 3, and I've been therefore harbouring an enduring fascination and curiosity about life. When it got to the 1980s and I was completing my undergraduate degree, it became clear to me that life was in trouble, and ever since then I've been doing everything I can to protect, to conserve and look after it. I have, to be honest with you, I think that my generation and others have failed in that duty. We presided over enormous declines when it comes to the richness of life on our planet. But at the same time, we have tried and tested a whole portfolio of means of restoring that life, repairing ecosystems, reintroducing species. So it's not that we haven't developed a toolkit, it's simply that we haven't used it.
Yeah.
So as part and parcel of my mission now, as a 63-year-old person, I want to provide a platform, a foundation for young people to do all of the things which we have at our disposal, but to do it with a much more assured sense of urgency, and to do it more broadly. I'm a firm believer that we shouldn't be listening to young people in a patronising fashion, but we should be empowering them to take decisions. Young people are clear thinking, clear speaking. They're not risk averse, they're bold, they're brave, they get things done. And as someone whose generation has failed to get things done, then I see it as very much a part and parcel of my duty at the moment is to provide that empowerment to young people to get on with it. And that's why I'm a very keen supporter and champion of Scarlett's work. She's remarkable. And there are many other remarkable young people out there who are doing brilliant things, and all credit to them. And as I say, my job, and I believe that of my generation now, is to increasingly facilitate that, make it, delegate that power, basically, to that decision-making process.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's amazing to hear. And obviously lovely words about Scarlett, well deserved. Scarlett, can I hand it questions?
Yeah, so you've basically already answered this to an extent, but as you know, our Teach the Parent campaign supports young people, and we'd love to know a bit more about you as a young person. What and when was it that you got into wildlife and nature?
So I grew up in a 3 up, 3 down. Speaking to you this afternoon from the New Forest, so it was quite close to here. I grew up on the edge of Southampton. We had a very small garden, but I was immediately fascinated by all of those simple organisms that lived there. So it was tadpoles, snails, slugs, ladybirds, nothing exotic at all. We had a small zoo in Southampton in the 1960s, and I would beg my mother at this time of year, summer holidays, to take me there every single day, because I just liked being in the proximity of animals. I also used to capture quite a lot of them. I mean, they were quite small, so I only needed jam jars and boxes to put them in, and there I would study them. All of that changed when I got to my teens, and my father gave me a pair of binoculars, and I realised I could learn more about creatures in their own environment rather than bringing them into mine. So then I kind of gave up keeping things and spent a lot more time outside looking at things. And I'd made up my mind when I was 13 that I wanted to stay in the academic system. So I therefore charted a course through my as it was O levels, now GCSEs, A levels, and undergraduate degree to do that. But then I had a change of heart. I was an undiagnosed autistic person, and that was, by that stage, was having quite a significant impact on my life. And I recognised that I probably wasn't best suited to stay in the academic system. Something that I've often regretted in some ways, because I love learning and I love spending time with people who love learning. But ultimately, it wasn't to be. So I've ended up making TV programs and now spend most of my time campaigning on behalf of the health of our planet and everything that lives on it.
Thank you. That's lovely to hear. Did you want to carry on with the question, Scarlett, or did you want to take turns?
Yeah, I can carry on. Sorry. A great answer as always. So with your science background, could you please explain what biodiversity even means?
Well, yeah, biodiversity is something that we talk about all the time, but we don't often explain what that meaning is and its parameters. So biodiversity is the number of different living things in a given area at a particular point in time. So very often, I think we are encouraged to think that for the best results when it comes to biodiversity, that would be the biggest number of living things. But that's not necessarily the case. If you're in a desert or the bottom of a deep ocean, there are limited resources there in terms of how you can get food and find mates and so on and so forth. So there won't be a large biodiversity. So when we speak about biodiversity, we're more interested in completeness than total numbers. So what we would like to satisfy a good biodiversity index is all the living things that can live in a given area at a given time being able to be living there. So it's the completeness index that we're particularly interested in. But we use it as a parameter in natural sciences to, measure declines, increases and changes in animals' distributions. So it may well be that there are species in the UK, for instance, butterflies and birds, which are moving on account of climate breakdown. So they're shifting from the southeast towards the northwest in response to climatic changes. So there you would argue that the biodiversity of the southeast is being diminished, but it's through abiotic forces, and it's being increased in the northwest. So biodiversity is always going to be a dynamic thing as well. We've got to accept change as part of that indices.
What do you think that the state of biodiversity is in the UK specifically?
So in the UK, we're very fortunate. There are lots of geeky people like me who have learned the name of all of the plants behind me and all the butterflies and birds and so on and so forth. And for a long time, we've been going out and surveying all of that life. And we live in a relatively small set of countries, and we don't have too many of each species. So let's think about our butterflies, maybe 55, 56, 57, including migrants. When it's our bat species, maybe 14, 15, 16 species. Mammals in total, terrestrial mammals, not that many, around 48, 50. So it's quite easy for us to get to know all of these creatures. And Britain has always had within its culture, people who are fascinated by wildlife. So we go out, we do all of these surveys, we put our finger on the pulse, and I would argue that we probably know more about the state of life in the UK than any other part of the planet, simply because of the density of good naturalists and the good recording schemes that we have. Well, every 4 years, we publish something called the State of Nature. It does what it says on the tin. It measures the state of nature in the UK. And we've had 4 of these reports so far. And what they show us is that we are one of the most nature depleted set of nations anywhere on the planet. So by that, I mean that we have destroyed more of our habitats and forced declines upon more of our species than all but a handful of other places on our planet, which is a bit ironic given what I've just told you about how many people there are who love wildlife here. But we've been too intensive with our farming, we've been too intensive with our forestry and fishing, and these are the principal drivers that the state of nature indicates as impacting negatively on our biodiversity. And as a couple more stats, I can tell you that 1 in 6 species that are monitored, so that's not all species, the monitored species that we have in the UK are now threatened with extinction. We have the smallest amount of of woodland cover in Western Europe. We've got about 13%, whereas France, for instance, our nearest neighbour, has got about 39%. And of that 13%, only 2% of it is ancient woodland, our most vital terrestrial habitat in terms of biodiversity richness. So we've not done a terribly good job at looking after our own backyard. And this can be quite embarrassing when we focus our attention on deforestation in other parts of the world and forget that we've pretty much deforested the whole of the UK. So we ought to be concentrating on, looking after ourselves as well as making sure that other people look after other parts of the world.
Involved in figuring out how biodiverse their own areas are?
Sorry, I missed that one, Scarlett.
Sorry, I've got terrible internet. What are the key markers of biodiversity, and is there a way that young people can monitor the biodiversity in their own area?
Yeah, there are. I mean, I think you should pick on a very apparent group of animals or plants. And when I say apparent, I mean things that are easy to see and measure. So we like choosing species like butterflies, for instance. As I mentioned, we don't have too many different species, so therefore they're relatively easy to identify with a bit of practice. They fly around in daylight. Some of them are quite brightly coloured. You can't miss them if they're there. So those apparent species are those which are most easy to monitor. And of course, you can join in the recording scheme. So at the moment, Butterfly Conservation has something called the Big Butterfly Count that is running. We ask for 15 minutes of your time to sit in one spot and count the number of butterflies. And we equally ask you to tell us if you don't see any or many butterflies, because negative data is as important as positive data. But if you want to do your own schemes, if you're lucky enough to have a garden, then that would be the first place to start. If not, there's a public green space near you somewhere, maybe a school space that you could look at. And the key thing is to keep diligent data in the same way. So when you go out and you come up with a method of counting something or measuring something, once you've decided that, stick with it. And then you can compare one set of data that you've collected with another set of data that you've collected. And it may well be that you don't see many changes in the short term, but then if you live to be as long as me, 63, if I go back through my diaries that I was writing as a teenager, I see very significant differences in the species that I encounter and their numbers. So those sorts of data sets are worth counting.
I think that sounds like such a good idea. I remember trying to write down what types of butterflies I saw in my garden when I was younger. I feel like it's a good way to spend the summer holidays, especially if you're running out of things to do. I know it's only the first day, but I'm sure in about 5 weeks' time, everyone's going to need more things to do over the holidays. So why do you think it's so important to protect biodiversity? I think you've already touched on this. And we've just spoken about how young people can and should maybe be involved. Why do you think that's important too?
Well, okay, you could make an argument and say, well, look, Chris, it doesn't really matter to me whether there are too many adders or there are too many skylarks. They don't play a role in my life. I've never seen one. Perhaps many people go through life. I mean, there are plenty of species, rest assured, that I haven't seen. I know they're out there, but I haven't seen them. So you could make a case that it doesn't matter to me. Well, it does matter because, as I've already mentioned, what we're looking at for long-term stability, sustainability and resilience in any ecosystem is to have as many of those species living there as possible. If you start pulling them out or they start disappearing, it destabilizes that community. And you can only pull a certain number out before you have what we call ecological collapse. Now, every day that we get up, those of us who are fortunate get to choose what we eat. And whatever we eat has come from what I call ecosystem services earth. So it's either come out of the soil, which is a functional ecological community of all sorts of microorganisms, slightly bigger things, worms, so on and so forth, bacteria on the micro scale of things. Without that being a healthy community, we simply couldn't produce the food. And then when we look at our oceans, some of you might eat fish. And if you do, that's been harvested from the sea, or some of it might have been unfortunately farmed, but the majority would have been harvested from the sea. the seas as an ecosystem are not healthy because we damage them with oil and plastic pollution, or with deep sea mining, or with overfishing, then that threatens our future. Our planet is relatively small, and we are now connected, whether we like it or not, to every single bit of that planet. And I can prove that to you, because all you need to do is go to your fridge. And if you've been out shopping, or your parents and guardians have been out shopping, and you open that and you look at the list of ingredients, you'll see that they won't have come from around the corner from where you live. Very many of them would have come from other parts of the world, and that connects you to those parts of the world. And I might choose one example. And it's a substance which is in a lot of our food. It's in our biofuel, if we're putting fuel into our cars. It's in cosmetics, shampoo, so on and so forth. It's called palm oil. Palm oil is the cheapest vegetable oil that we can produce on Earth. And in fact, we can produce it in the most efficient way. The problem with that is that we have destroyed more than 90% of the forests in Malaysia and Indonesia, where palm oil is growing. That's now spreading into Papua and back to where the plant originated in West Africa. And therefore, we've destroyed the homes of orangutan, forest elephant, many species of birds, all of those exotic things that you might have on your T-shirts and in your, wildlife encyclopedias. But, and that's all so that you can have a biscuit this afternoon, because it will be in your biscuits, as it will be in my biscuits if I go and open them. So, that connects us to other parts of the world, whereby, where we're modifying that environment so that we can survive, but we're destabilizing that environment because we're destroying it in the process. And that makes us vulnerable, very, very vulnerable. And of course, we've seen our vulnerability at the hands of nature recently, with tragic consequences with the COVID pandemic. COVID, was a disease that was harbored in other species of animals. It spread into humans, and with tragic and disastrous consequences. And that really, again, highlights our vulnerability when we mess with nature, basically. So retaining a complete biodiversity, not just in your back garden or mine, or even in the UK. So I've got a spider climbing over my camera, which is great. But around the world, is essential to our survival. So whether you're into skylarks, or whether you're into orangutans and forest elephants, it doesn't really matter. You're going to have a biscuit this afternoon, and that comes at the expense of their habitat, and that habitat having been destroyed.
I think it's so wild how even something small like having a biscuit, demonstrates the impact on biodiversity that we have. And that's a really, really good example. Thank you. So last time I saw you, it was just after the March for Wildlife, or March for Nature in Ormuz. Congratulations on that again. And I was just reading about the People's Manifesto for Wildlife, which I think goes hand in hand, that you were involved in drafting. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And what can young people and parents and guardians and carers do to protect biodiversity at different scales? You have already touched on this, but at home, school, parks, gardens, what's one thing you can do in each of those environments?
Yeah, so I put together the manifesto in 2018, and I basically asked a group of people, notably including young people, and also a diversity of young people, and that was a remit. So 50% of my contributors had to be female rather than just male, because white males have for way too long have sort of dominated the conservation side of things. And I was determined that we overcame that. So 50% female, as much racial mix in as possible, and other diversities too. And I'm very pleased to say that we managed to find people, and they were brilliant contributors, particularly the young contributors, who again thought clearly and wrote very passionately about what they needed to. The brief was to come up with 10 ideas in each of a range of different fields that would make an immediate difference tomorrow. So these are things that if we literally turned the tap off and turned it on to a different thing tomorrow, it would make an immediate difference for life, the environment, for addressing climate breakdown, so on and so forth. And we printed the manifesto, and I delivered it to every MP or elected representative, as it was at that time, in the UK. And we have plans for doing an updated manifesto. Now we have a period, one hopes, of stable government, and we'll hope be doing that in the near future. So again, I'll be reaching out to even more young people to contribute that, because I'd like to essentially double their voices in the next draft of that. And that was what it was about. There were a lot of people who come up with ideas, and they may well possibly work, but they could be maybe potentially take too long, or they could be too expensive, or they might be too controversial that they'll never actually happen. And what I wanted was those clean, simple ideas that would make a difference tomorrow. And what we found was, when I asked people for those, there was no shortage of them. So once again, it points to human imagination, creativity, ingenuity, adaptability. As a species, we're good at all of those things, but what we haven't been good at is rolling them out and making them work. And one of the things we looked at in the manifesto was, outside of the garden, when it came to protecting biodiversity in the UK, was looking at our national parks. So I'm speaking to you this afternoon from the New Forest National Park in the south of England, and we have a number of national parks in the UK. And I think that we tend to think of them as great repositories of nature, where everything is green and pleasant and everything is flourishing. But very sadly, that isn't the case. Often they're neglected, not well looked after, not properly financed, nor properly governed. So one of my contributors took a cold, hard look at our national parks and then came up with 10 ideas that how we could fix them for people and wildlife if we did it tomorrow. And I think it's worth researching that, that manifesto and other people's ideas too, because, we do have small gardens, and we know that all of our gardens added together add up to an area the size of Suffolk, which is a pretty large county. So there's a lot of gardens in the UK. So if we all did the right thing, then that might make a significant difference. But equally, we know that some people have to use their gardens to park their cars on. They don't have a choice. So we really do need to take bigger, bolder, braver action in other parts of our environment. And therefore, we need to put pressure on our governments and our national parks to improve those spaces, as I said, for people and wildlife, because they're much bigger than all of our gardens. And so we are reliant on those people to fix those problems. And I think as we reach, we go ever closer to the precipice, I do think that we're nudging that point where we're going to be making a last stand for nature. Then it's important that we stand up and ask for those changes to be made, and made now. And that's what the march that you mentioned, Scarlett, was all about. This was 60 to 100,000 people effectively saying to the government, we care about nature and we want you to fix it as rapidly as possible. We've got the means, we've got the toolkit. We need your support to make sure that we can fix it as rapidly as possible. So I think that do what you can yourself. That's always empowering, makes you feel good, you make a difference. That's great. But we have to accept that we need others to act on our behalf too. And that's why I think it's very important for young people to engage in political conversations. When I say political, I don't necessarily mean party politics. I'm talking about decision making, political decision making. And yours are the generations that need to influence those decisions, because yours are the generations that will be growing into the results of those decisions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's great to hear about the manifesto. I think that's such a good way to approach it, especially if you're, feeling hopeless in the whole climate and ecological crisis. It's good to have those, easy actions that are accountable. So thank you for the work you've been doing on that. It's clear that you get involved with so many campaigns. How do you choose which ones to get really involved with so much going on, both here and in different parts of the world? Obviously, time is very limited. How do you sort of prioritise that?
Well, I'm lucky that I don't sleep very much, so I can be quite busy. I've begun to focus far more on the bigger issue campaigns. So I think that going forward over the next year or so, we're going to be looking critically at reform of farming, forestry and fishing in the UK. We know that we can make a difference there, and we know the sorts of things that we need to do. Driving those changes will be very difficult, because the might of the farming, fishing and forestry fraternities is so strong that it puts other people off that challenge, and they haven't been standing up to be counted, but someone's got to. The other thing is, obviously, we've got to keep fossil fuels in the ground. There's no ambiguity about that. Our own climate change committee have told us that. The global science community tells us that. The UN tells us that. So we will be campaigning to make sure that this government upholds its promises when not granting any new licenses for fossil fuel exploration or exploitation. But equally, were licenses granted by the former government, and we want to see those quashed as well. We also want to make sure that we therefore see significant investment in renewable energies, generating jobs for people of your generation in wind, solar, wave, all of those things that can provide us with the cheapest, most efficient energy possible. And those technologies are there to be further researched and implemented. So we're going to be driving for that. And then obviously there are a few other causes which are very close to my heart because I love life. So we'll be campaigning against the badger cull. I continue to campaign against illegal fox hunting. That's not going to solve the world when we stop it, but I think it will send a really clear signal to, to the UK at least, that we can't waste life anymore. We can't tear wildlife to pieces with dogs for fun. That's no longer socially acceptable, and it can't be done in a biodiversity crisis. So yeah, don't worry, I'm going to be busy. I'm always trying to find. Today, actually, I've put this jumper on because I came outside, but I've been working for this group of people called Animals Asia. And Animals Asia have launched a campaign today where they are asking people when they go on holiday to report incidences of animal cruelty overseas, because we do have a law in the UK which is in place to make sure that our travel companies, if you're booking a holiday in the UK, are not allowed to offer you tickets, as it were, to an attraction, if that's what you call it, where poor standards of animal welfare exist. The trouble is there's no detail in the law. So animalsasia.org are asking, if you go on holiday this year and you see instances of animal cruelty or exploitation, report them at animalsasia.org, and we'll crunch that data, and we're going to go back to government and see if we can't make that law a little bit more robust. So that's my job today. I'm on that one until I finish Channel 5 News this afternoon.
Wow, so much. I mean, great to hear about every single thing that you're doing, obviously, and hope that you get some rest at some point. But it's really nice to hear that, that the campaigns that you do choose to get involved in sort of have that knock-on effect in inspiring other people and other programs to have that wider effect on society, which is amazing. So I'd like to go on and sort of talk about what's been happening recently and how we can sort of move forward in the future and do things differently, perhaps. So we talked about the role of parents and family before. So as someone who works with young people and has played the role of an elder, what are some tricks or ideas that young people can use to talk to their parents about protecting biodiversity, do you think?
Well, I think that, the trouble with most older people, and I'm going to take myself out of that category, I like change. I like the idea of constantly changing my opinions about things. I like to see, not problems, but opportunities. So if something isn't working, I don't see that as necessarily a problem. I want to reframe that in my mind to think, actually, that's presenting me with an opportunity to think differently and do things differently. Unfortunately, I think when people do get older, sometimes they become lazy and they would rather stick with the status quo. Well, we can't stick with the status quo at the moment. If we stay doing things the way we're doing them now, things are going to get worse. So we've got to make those changes. So I think that if you're speaking to your parents or your guardians, it's just all about research from my point of view. If you go to them with a solution to a problem which is going to be beneficial for you, for them, and for whatever it happens to be, biodiversity or the environment, then it's harder for them to make a case not to do it. Now, you might say, okay, I think that we should give up our petrol or diesel vehicle and my parents should buy an electric vehicle. And you could go to them and say, look, this isn't the answer. There are issues with the batteries, but in the short term, we live in an urban area. It's better for people's health because of the respiratory problems caused by, petrol and diesel vehicles. Your parents might come back to you and say, well, hold on a minute. Where are we going to put the charging point? There isn't a place for us to put a charging point. Where is the local charger? Where could I charge this car if I can't charge it at home?
Mm-hmm.
How much are these electric cars? How much are they to buy? How much are they to lease? How much is our car worth? What sort of cash back are we going to get? All of those questions they're going to come back to you with. So don't let them. Do all the work in advance. Find out if you could get a car charger, where the local chargers are, how much they charge to cost, how long it will take. Look at the value of the vehicle that you've got. Think about how much that you're going to get for that if you trade it in against the value of an electric car. Look at the range of that car. Will it be enough to take your family to work and back? Maybe they take you to school. Will that get you to school? And then your mother, your father, your guardian to their place of work, vice versa. All of those sort of calculations, which they would need to do, you could do for them. And at that point, you can make a much stronger case, maybe, I mean, I just chose an example about the electric car, for getting an electric car. So I always think that, if you can provide good information, good data, then that allows people to make best informed decisions. And they're more likely to take them if they can see that that's going to work. Now, a young man that I know, who's the son of someone I work with in TV, and this is how I know about this, he really got into the idea of putting solar on the roof. So he spoke to his parents, the guy that I work with, and said, I think we should have solar panels on the roof. And superficially, it looked like that was going to be disproportionately expensive, except that this young man had figured out that if he could get 6 of his neighbours, 6 of the other people in the street, to have the solar panels too, then the cost would come down to the extent that it would be beneficial for all of those individual families. So he did that. And then he went round and he knocked on the door of all the neighbours. And eventually he found, I think it was 13 families in the end that decided to invest in solar. And so they went for it. And that was a perfect example of this young man. And he was, pretty young. What should we say? Under 12 at that point. But he did all the research, presented the case, and they have got solar on their roof. And that was because he put together a good case study of why that would be a good idea. So I do think that sometimes, we can all have brilliant ideas at the dining table. I tell you what, why don't we stop doing this? Why don't we start doing that? But you've got to be able to back them up so that they actually work. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, that's such a brilliant idea, and what a lovely story about the solar panels. That obviously knowledge is such a barrier a lot of the time, and so breaking that barrier for them. Thank you. And along similar lines then, often the topic of biodiversity sort of sidelined many households because it might not seem like a priority for parents, they've got going on. So how do you think we could get parents to act other than, helping them with the knowledge, seeing it as a priority?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, parents and guardians are going to be the decision makers because they're the breadwinners, they're the people with their hands on the bank account. So again, you need to show that it's beneficial. And I think that when it comes to biodiversity, there are many things that you could do which don't cost a lot of money. So if you're lucky enough to have a garden, you can put up bird boxes, you can feed the birds, you can put in hedgehog boxes, you can allow your garden to go wild, as you can see mine is behind me. Certainly we don't get the lawnmower out here. In fact, we don't even own a lawnmower. There are those sorts of things. And then they could still say to you, yeah, all right, so you want to spend, a few tens, even a few hundreds pounds on modifying our garden. What are we going to get out of it? Well, the answer is good mental health.
Yeah.
What a place to relax. I come out here, I sit in my garden, I hear birds singing, I watch the butterflies, the bees, or the other insects. It's a lot more interesting than a flat piece of lawn. And what we learned, and a lot of people learned during the lockdown periods a few years ago, was that access to green space was a brilliant way of improving our mental health. So again, that's one of the things that I would pitch if I were you. I wouldn't pitch it just saying I want to make turn the garden into a nature reserve. You want to make it into a place where it's good for our mental health and well-being as well.
Yeah. What are some programs that young people can be involved in relating to biodiversity or conservation, do you think, from your experience?
So I missed the first part of that question. Sorry, you broke up a little bit.
Sorry. And what are some programs that young people can get involved in relating to biodiversity or conservation?
Well, okay, so we're lucky in the UK. We have a lot of what we call non-governmental organisations, and by that I mean a lot of them are charities. So we have things like the Wildlife Trust, and we have the RSPB, and we have the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust, Butterfly Conservation I've already mentioned. And pretty much any group of animals in the UK is sufficiently loved by a sufficient number of people that they'll set up a charity to learn more about them and protect them. So the first thing I would say is, use those resources. You don't necessarily have to be a member, but you can go to their websites. There are all sorts of things there where they'll offer suggestions for you to things to do. So, for instance, every year the Wildlife Trust runs something called 30 Days Wild, and they encourage, you know, people, particularly young people, to choose one different thing every day for 30 consecutive days, which will essentially bring them into contact with nature a bit more. So sometimes it's about giving to nature, sometimes it's about engaging for nature, and everything from, you know, okay, topping up your bird feeder, or maybe drawing and painting some birds, thinking about some creative writing, another way of engaging with that as part and parcel of your life. So the first thing I would say is research all of that, and I'm sure you'll find something in amongst that plethora of websites where there's ideas and programs for you to do. And certainly when it comes to the design, the making of, the timing, the methods of trying to improve any space you've got for biodiversity, all that information is out there, and I can assure you it's been tried and tested, and if you put it in, it will work. I can think of an example. So a few years ago, sort of bee houses became popular. So these are sort of basically blocks with tubes in, where things like mason bees and leafcutter bees will go into the tubes. And this was going back a long time, but anyway, I made one of these. I thought that's good, and I put it up in my house, and there were no bees in it for a long time. I thought, what's going on? I've done my duty here. I've provided them with a potential resource. But then I learned online that actually they like to have those placed in full sunshine, which is counterintuitive because you'd imagine they'd just cook. But so I moved my bee houses onto the front of the house, and they're absolutely rammed with bees. This year we had to build 2 more because there were so many bees. And so it's just those little simple things that you can either learn by trial and error yourself, or you can just read and then you can make a difference. So it always goes back to research. I think, you know, there's plenty of resources out there where you can research things so that if you're going to take some time to help nature, it will pay dividends.
Yeah, thank you. That's brilliant. And then so on the topic of young people sort of taking that next step, there's lots of young people who obviously want to get involved or speak up, but they either don't feel supported or listened to or have the confidence to do. So obviously you've got this experience on TV and things like that. So what maybe advice would you give them?
You're important. Every single one of you that's on this call, and everyone in your class and in your school, every single one of you is important. You know, you have hopes, you have aspirations, you have things that you need and want. You know, you have dreams and maybe ambitions and things that you would like to do and see and feel. And those things are all important. Don't ever let anyone pretend that they're not. And if you want those things to become real, then sometimes you have to stand up and be counted. And so use your desires, use the fact that you want a healthy, happy planet where you can, live that long and healthy life. That should be a driving thing for you. So don't let anyone tell you you're not important, or your voice doesn't matter, or they're not interested. Every one of you is important, and what you want, it has to count. So I think recognizing that, and then knowing that you collectively, you've got a very powerful voice. You've got a powerful voice as individuals, but collectively you've got a very powerful voice. And there may well come a time when you'll need to use that. And that could be in your classroom, it could be in your school, in your community, or it could be an even bigger thing. And we go back to 2019 when there was the schools' climate marches, Fridays for Future. Young people exercised their voice, they took to the streets, they made people listen. And they played a really important role in getting our governments, local councils, companies, businesses to declare a climate emergency. Without that, it wouldn't have happened. Yeah. So but bear in mind that you are powerful, important and powerful.
That's a lovely message, and so important that all of the people watching today and across the country can hear that message and know that they are important. So thank you just for emphasizing that. So we've got one last question, which is if you could ask young people to do one action to protect biodiversity, what would it be?
Well, we face significant problems when it comes to impacting on biodiversity. Obviously, climate breakdown is one. However, another is agriculture, and particularly animal agriculture. So going back to that point that I made earlier, that many of us are fortunate to choose what we eat. And we know that one of the biggest drivers, if not the biggest driver, of biodiversity loss on a global scale, so that's going back to that, 70% loss of wildlife since 1970 that I mentioned. It's a colossal loss of life across the planet in a very short space of time. The principal driver for that is animal agriculture. So if you were going to do one thing that would instigate that change, it would be to eat less meat. So I'm not telling you to go vegan overnight. I'm suggesting to you that there are opportunities out there to eat less meat and also to eat meat at this point of higher welfare standards. So things that are not factory farmed, where animals have had as close to a decent life as they can possibly have. So that would be my suggestion. It's difficult for young people to impact. We've talked about electric cars and so on and so forth, but you can choose what you eat. And as soon as you're given money to go shopping for your own food, and maybe you do that when you go to school each day, or you're choosing from the school menu, you're there in line, you need to be telling those people that you don't want to eat meat. You want a meat-free Monday, and then maybe you want a meat-free Wednesday, and you want them to invest in looking at vegan and vegetarian alternatives, because that's better for life, it's better for the planet, and it will be better for your health, and it will be better for animal welfare. So I would suggest that for young people, thinking about what you put in your mouth is the most important thing you can do to protect global biodiversity.
Okay, thank you so much. And yeah, it's really difficult, as you said, for young people who have fewer of those choices because they don't do their own shopping. But it's important to remember that it doesn't have to be one thing or the other, that you can make these smaller choices, can't you? And just try your best.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it's about a transition. It isn't about saying to your parents, right, I'm going vegan tomorrow, because they probably bought some chicken, they got it in the fridge and they want to give it to you. It's about moving through a transition and constantly looking at those opportunities as they arise to make those sorts of changes. So I think you've got to be tolerant, you've got to be patient, and you've got to be kind when it comes to making those sorts of transitions. And those are the three key ingredients to getting it right. If you want to ask people to change, then you've got to be tolerant, patient, and kind. Because if you just fight them, they'll probably just resist you and nothing will happen.
Thank you. Yeah, that's amazing. And so how we sort of round off these lives will be giving these simple actions of things that people can do to benefit biodiversity and things like that. So first of all, we'll ask the people watching today, can you picture what your garden or your neighbourhood would look like if biodiversity was protected and flourishing? If you think about that for a second, then maybe we can consider how we can make that happen and what steps you can take. There are community gardening initiatives in a lot of places or something like that. You can also read about the link between the climate and the biodiversity crisis. Things like the Manifesto for Wildlife, the People's Manifesto for Wildlife, are an amazing place to start reading about that. You can talk to your parents, guardians and carers, your friends, your children if you have them, about how they can protect biodiversity in your garden or your community. And you can act. And as Chris Packham said, this is one of the most important things. You can eat less meat and you can make those choices one by one, the choices that you can make that are in your hands to reduce your meat intake. And being tolerant, patient and kind, I really love that as that sort of triad of how we're going to make this happen. You can share this live with your friends and get them to join the movement at teachtheparent.org and help us basically reach across the country, across the world. And there's other things that you can do, looking for biodiversity with apps on your phone, like Seek or Merlin or things like that. So we've got a couple more minutes. I didn't know if we had any audience questions that anyone would like to ask Chris while we've got him here. And whilst you're sending those in, I have got one that we picked up from earlier, which was how do we get other people on board with protecting biodiversity without sounding preachy? They said you're so good at it, Chris.
Well, I think it's about offering them something that they want from it. Not everyone wants to fall in love with birds and butterflies, but they may want just somewhere quiet to sit and refresh their mind and find some calm. Young people these days live in a very pressured environment. you're pressured at school, constantly tested. That can be really stressful for a lot of people. And then you come back, you've got your social media. I can't imagine how difficult it is to navigate that as a younger person. So all of these stresses on life, you know, just if you find some space like this, you can just go and sit out there and literally chill. And it really works. And this isn't, you know, Chris, getting spiritual. This is something that's been measured scientifically. So we've looked at young people and their learning environments, and we find that if they're learning outdoors, they learn things more quickly, they retain the information for longer, and they do better in exam situations, simply because they're sat under a tree, not in a concrete classroom. So that speaks to the power of nature.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. It's great how you can really reframe your mindset in that way. Someone's also asked how to keep going when the fight is long and complicated, and I really feel that.
Well, winning is not giving up. That's my mantra. I don't expect ever to achieve any of my objectives, but for me, the job is just to not give up and to keep trying. And that's, I think, what you have to look at. I think if you set yourself identifiable goals, then sometimes, you know, you either make them too easy and therefore it doesn't achieve anything, or if you make them too hard, it can be demoralizing. So I don't have those sorts of goals. I just think, like, for me, the job is to get up every single day and try and make a difference. And I don't expect to see a reward for that. I don't expect to medal a cup or to cross a line. I just know that if I keep going, and I keep trying to do positive things, they don't always work, I'll be honest with you, but if I keep trying to do positive things, in the end, it might make some small difference.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think we might leave it there if that's okay. It's been amazing to hear you speak today, Chris. And thank you everyone for sending in the questions. It's been so lovely to chat to you and hear your insight on this sort of thing. And hopefully everyone has some idea about, you know, the actions that they can take forwards now to make a difference. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And remember, all of those young people out there, you're powerful. And all of those older people out there, allow those young people to exercise their power and their rights to make decisions. Don't just listen to them, allow them to make those decisions.
Amazing. We have just got a couple of people asking, they were so impressed with the young conservationists and everyone on 8 out of 10 bats. Will it be back this year?
Well, so we're thinking about other projects that we can do. So we've got a couple of ideas at the moment, and we're trying to find funding for one of them, but our plan is very definitely to keep that model. And again, that was, as you know, it was all about giving young people opportunities so they can find their foot on the ladder. So yeah, rest assured, 8 out of 10 bats may be hibernating, but it's definitely not migrating away.
Amazing. Okay, well, have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And myself, Scarlett, and we hope to see you for the next one next month. Thanks.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.